Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a lantern-lit alley in 17th century Istanbul. The air smells like warm cardamom and the tiniest hint of tobacco. You hear the clink of ceramic cups, the lull of conversation in a dozen dialects, and the occasional burst of laughter that quickly softens. Almost embarrassed to be so loud, you duck under a wooden sign carved with crescent moons and steam swirls, and step into your very first Ottoman Coffeehouse, part living room, part debate stage, part napping zone, and entirely unlike anything you've ever known. Welcome to the coffeehouse culture of the Ottoman Empire. Surprisingly cozy, socially electric, and, depending on the decade, probably banned. And no pressure, but you probably wouldn't survive this world more than a week without getting lost, duped, or mistaken for a Venetian spy. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is there. Are you the kind of person who wins down at 18:30, or are we sharing a cup at 2014 AM? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You push open the wooden door, and the first thing that hits you is warmth. Not just from the brass brazier glowing in the center of the room, but from the density of quiet, shared comfort. Every person here is doing something different, and yet no one feels out of place. Over there, a scholar adjusts his robe and scratches out verses in Arabic calligraphy with a reed pen. Beside him, two old men squint over a game of backgammon, their cube-shaped dice bouncing off a hand-carved board. Someone behind you hums a tune, and there's that unmistakable sizzle, pop of boiling says pots over charcoal, filling the space with the hypnotic smell of roasted coffee beans and bitter sweetness. Your host, an impossibly graceful teenager in loose cotton trousers, glides toward you holding a narrow silver tray with 3 cups and not a single rattle. His name's probably Hasan, or maybe Yusuf. You're not sure. He doesn't introduce himself, and he doesn't need to. He places a cup before you with such quiet flourish you half expect applause. You try to sip right away. Mistake, it's about 900 degrees Celsius. Maybe wait a moment. The room is dim but not gloomy. Most coffee houses use colored glass lanterns hung at varying heights, giving everything a flickering, underwater kind of glow. The walls, think shelves of books, stacks of cushions, sometimes embroidered poetry or faded paintings of wild-eyed horses. The Ottoman Coffeehouse wasn't just a place to drink something, it was a state of being, an institution. A lifestyle choice. Mainstream historians agree that by the late 1500s, Istanbul had dozens of these cafes. By the mid-1600s, hundreds, and by the 18th century, you could walk from one end of the city to the other without ever sobering up, on caffeine, that is. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Right now, your cup is cooled enough for that first sip. It's thick. Like, mud thick. This isn't your triple shot oat milk latte. There's grit at the bottom, and a bitter profile that makes your molars remember they exist. But then comes the second sip, and something clicks. The flavor isn't just strong, it's layered. Smoke, spice, maybe even hints of cardamom or clove if the beans were stored next to the spice cart that week. And suddenly, you're aware this is not a quick, drink and go kind of place. Nobody's looking at the door, no one's scrolling through TikTok. The entire point is to sit, and sip, and drift. Quirky side note, coffee was sometimes brewed with ambergris. Yep, the waxy stuff whales spit up. Historians still argue whether that was for flavor, medicinal reasons, or just flexing imperial wealth. In this little cafe, though, it's just you, your cup, and the quiet choreography of Ottoman leisure. Outside, camels shuffle past hauling dates and damask cloth. A muezzin's voice hums faintly from a distant minaret. Someone walks in smelling like rain and goat leather. And here you are, perfectly anonymous, gently caffeinated, and slowly absorbing the very first moments of what will become a centuries-long tradition, gathering in public to drink something warm, listen to ideas, and pretend not to eavesdrop on the guy at the next cushion over. Already, you're beginning to notice how many roles this one space is playing. It's a library without rules, a tavern without booze, a parliament without yelling, a bedroom without walls, and somehow, without anyone saying so, it's become clear that this coffee house is more than a room. It's a portal. One you're now part of. One you may never want to leave. You stretch your legs a little under the low table, careful not to knock over the brazier perched a few feet away. Someone nearby just cracked a walnut with the back of a spoon. No rush, no cleanup panic. That's the rhythm here. Slow, considered, and surprisingly full of tiny noises that somehow make the room feel quieter. As the evening deepens, the cavihan fills with more people. They don't barge in like customers, they enter like cast members. Some greet everyone with a subtle nod, others glide straight to their usual cushion, where someone's already left their favorite hookah pipe leaning against the wall. No one rushes to serve them. No one asks, "What'll you have?" They'll get coffee, eventually. Right now, there's storytelling to do. You notice one man at the far end rise to his feet. His robe is creased, his beard more theoretical than full, and he's holding, yep, that's a lute. He plucks a lazy string, clears his throat, and launches into what can only be described as a half-sung, half-chanted story about a cunning merchant who tried to outwit a djinn and ended up married to a goat. You don't catch all the plot points. Doesn't matter. This is the cultural heart of the Ottoman Empire in action: improvised performances, wandering poets, and yes, goat marriage ballads. In fact, many coffeehouses doubled as unofficial theaters. Shadow puppets, musical interludes, and even political satire disguised as folktales filled these low-lit rooms with a kind of intellectual electricity, just barely grounded by the smell of roasting beans. Mainstream records tell us that the first official Ottoman coffeehouses popped up in the 1550s, likely introduced by two Syrian merchants named Hakim and Shams. They set up shop in Istanbul and quickly became caffeinated celebrities. Before long, their idea spread faster than a morning espresso shot. Within decades, nearly every neighborhood had its own spot for sipping, gossiping, and, inevitably, debating. You overhear one such debate now. Two scholars, both well into their 50s, are arguing over whether the Prophet Muhammad ever personally consumed coffee. One insists yes, citing a deeply obscure text. The other shakes his head so hard his turban shifts. Neither seems angry. If anything, they're enjoying the disagreement the way some people savor dessert. This was common. Coffee houses became hubs of religious discussion, philosophical pondering, and more than a few impromptu poetry slams. But not everyone approved. The Ottoman elite, especially the more conservative officials, were deeply suspicious of these places. Not because of the coffee, because of the talk. Historians still argue whether the government feared rebellion or just disliked laughter that wasn't state-sanctioned. Either way, several sultans tried banning the cavihan altogether. Coffee houses were shuttered. Coffee was called an intoxicant, and at one point, they even hired spies to eavesdrop on what people were saying inside. Imagine that a secret police force whose main task was creeping around bean-scented rooms listening to poetry. But like most great caffeine-fueled ideas, coffee houses proved too resilient to extinguish. They'd close for a month, pop up 3 blocks down. A different name, a slightly different decor. Sometimes they pretended to be barbershops. Sometimes actual barbers just added a coffee corner. You shift your seat and realize the cushion beneath you is hand-embroidered. A lazy green vine winds its way around the edges, stitched by someone's grandmother, no doubt. Probably stuffed with goat hair if we're being honest. A young man beside you yawns and pulls a silk scarf over his eyes. Nap time. Totally allowed. Some Ottoman cafes even had built-in napping nooks, curtained off with woven hangings. In a city with chaotic streets, roaring markets, and occasional plagues, the coffee house was both shield and sanctuary. And lest you think this world belonged only to bearded scholars and lute pluckers, think again. While some cavihans were men, only especially in central Istanbul, others allowed women, or were specifically designed for them. Elite women sometimes hosted their own private coffee salons, complete with storytelling, embroidery contests, and debate topics like, was the peach or the fig the true fruit of paradise? Quirky note: in the 17th century, it was entirely acceptable for an Ottoman woman to divorce her husband if he failed to provide her with daily coffee. No joke. The courts upheld it. A caffeine shortage could break a marriage. So you're not just sipping in a quiet little cafe, you're participating in one of the earliest experiments in social caffeine democracy, a space where religion, politics, literature, and naps were all swirled together. No sugar necessary. A breeze stirs the edge of the lantern light, flickering shadows across the domed ceiling. Someone refills your cup without a word. The stories continue, soft and strange, curling around you like steam. You can feel yourself slipping into a different kind of awareness. One where time stretches, and history doesn't march so much as shuffle its feet, softly, like slippers on tile. And that's when you hear it: laughter, light and bubbling, from a group near the window. They're watching a parrot on someone's shoulder attempt to mimic the call to prayer. Badly, the bird squawks something that sounds more like, "Bring me dates." Everyone laughs again, including you. Welcome to the Ottoman coffee house. where birds might pray, goats get married, and you, oddly enough, belong. Your cup's gone cold. You didn't notice at first, because the air inside the coffee house is warm and thick with the fragrance of cardamom and charcoal smoke. But now that your fingertips brush the ceramic again, you notice the chill. A tiny frown crosses your face, and then, as if summoned by some ancient, caffeinated ritual, a boy no older than 12 whisks your cup away and replaces it with another. Still steaming, still just a little too hot to sip. You offer a sleepy nod. He grins like he's just served the Sultan himself. That's how service works here, quiet, invisible, ceremonial. These coffeehouse apprentices, called huraks, are as much a part of the furniture as the cushions and copper kettles. They spend their days brewing coffee over embers, fetching water, delivering letters between patrons, and memorizing conversations they're far too young to understand. And someday, if they're lucky and no one catches them napping on the job, they'll inherit a coffeehouse of their own. You watch him dart between tables, balancing a brass tray with the flair of a miniature juggler. He weaves past a pair of chess players deep in thought. One's chewing on a fig pit, the other's chewing on regret. He just realized he's trapped his own vizier. Chess is always available here, alongside backgammon, dominoes, and a game that involves flicking tiny pebbles at a board painted with numbers no one fully agrees on the rules for. Games are part of the coffeehouse DNA, casual, competitive, and often interrupted by sudden philosophical arguments or snack deliveries. Speaking of snacks tonight, it's candied almonds, sesame rings, and something sticky involving rosewater that has glued itself permanently to your thumb. Nobody seems to mind. In fact, getting mildly gooey seems to be part of the fun. You overhear a new topic now drifting across the room like a half-remembered dream: coffee fortunes. Turns out that, once a patron has finished their drink, they can flip the cup over onto its saucer, let it cool, and then have someone read the remaining grounds. A falk or fortune teller scans the patterns and makes pronouncements that range from, "You'll find great love by the river," to, "Avoid figs next week." This practice was especially popular among women, who, barred from some public coffeehouses, hosted their own gatherings where fortune telling, matchmaking, and political whispers brewed alongside the beans. Historians still argue whether these home-based coffee circles were more progressive than the public cafes, or just more constrained by a different set of rules. Either way, the saucer never lies. Or at least, it lies with style. A soft burst of rain taps against the tiled roof. You glance up, wondering whether it's loud enough to drown out the next recitation. But no, it just joins the rhythm of the room, like a gentle percussion section. Someone nearby is reading aloud from a thick, leather-bound book. He has a voice like honey left too long in the sun, slow, sticky, with a rasp that makes each syllable sound vaguely like a confession. It's a passage from the Masnavi, a Sufi poetic work that spins metaphor into something close to hypnosis. The words flow over you, tangled in metaphor and moonlight. You understand, maybe every third line. Doesn't matter, that's not the point. The point is that you're in a space where people absorb knowledge sideways. Through story, joke, lament, and daydream, books live here, not shelved, but spoken. By the mid-17th century, the popularity of Ottoman coffeehouses had reached such a level that even European visitors began writing about them with a mix of fascination and low-key judgment. They couldn't decide if these places were decadent dens of laziness or brilliant centers of low-cost education. Probably both. One French observer described a coffeehouse as a school for idle philosophers, which sounds a bit like an insult, until you remember that idle philosophers are usually the ones who end up inventing things like algebra or modern democracy, or at the very least, new rules for backgammon. There's a story floating around the empire, maybe true, maybe embroidered beyond recognition, that one Ottoman sultan disguised himself as a commoner to visit a kavihane and eavesdrop on the people's mood. He sat quietly in a corner, sipped his coffee, and listened to a spirited debate about tax reforms. No one recognized him, and when he left, he supposedly whispered, "We are better ruled than we deserve." Historians still argue whether that event ever really happened. Some claim it was propaganda to flatter the ruler. Others think it was just a folktale turned into political bedtime reading. Either way, it tells you what coffeehouses meant to the people. Places where the pulse of the empire could be felt. Not through proclamations, but through murmurs. You lean back and close your eyes for a moment, imagining the conversations that once filled this same room. The arguments over Persian poetry, the laughter over someone's badly burned beans, The debates about whether dreams meant anything. The size of someone remembering a love letter left unanswered. That's the thing about the Ottoman coffeehouse, it wasn't built to impress. It was built to endure. The same cushions, the same games, the same little moments. Passed on from generation to generation, like family secrets and good soup recipes. A drop of rain slips down the back of your neck from a leaky roof tile. You shiver, then smile. The apprentice rushes over with a threadbare shawl and a hot towel that smells faintly of cloves. You're not sure where he got either. You suspect he magicked them out of thin air. And just like that, you're warm again. You shift slightly on the cushion, now thoroughly molded to the shape of your evening. Your knees crack, but it's the soft, friendly kind of crack, like your joints are settling into a good book. Across the room, someone starts playing a ney flute, the notes long and breathy like wind threading through reeds. It's not a concert, exactly, more like an atmospheric flourish. You half expect someone to start narrating a tale of tragic love or accidental time travel, because that's how the mood feels, vaguely magical, vaguely melancholic, and somehow slightly caffeinated. Your fingers close around the handle of your refreshed cup. The steam fogs your eyelashes. The coffee is thick now, almost syrupy, and just bitter enough to remind you that sleep is probably not happening anytime soon. But that's okay. Because this, right here, this is how insomnia is meant to be spent. Let's talk a little about how this whole phenomenon began. It's sometime in the mid-16th century when the first coffeehouses begin opening in Istanbul, then called Constantinople, still wearing the perfume of its Byzantine past. The story goes that two men, Hakem and Shams, opened the first official kahvehane around 1555. The location, right near the Tatakel district, a bustling bazaar not far from the spice-laced air of the Golden Horn. Their coffeehouse was instantly a hit. Partly because the city already had a taste for the drink itself, thanks to earlier Sufi dervishes who used coffee to stay alert during midnight zikr ceremonies, but also because it offered something new, a public space not built around prayer or trade or power, but around presence, around conversation, around the delicious, shared act of doing nothing in particular. Now, coffee didn't arrive in the Ottoman world in a vacuum. It filtered in through the Arab world, likely originating from Yemen, where the dark beans were first roasted and brewed in ways that would eventually evolve into the thick, sludgy wonder you're sipping now. By the time it hit Istanbul, coffee was already more than a drink, it was a practice. One wrapped in ritual debate and the occasional government ban. Ah yes, the bans. Historians still argue whether Sultan Murad IV truly hated coffee, or just hated people getting together without permission. Either way, he issued a fierce prohibition on coffeehouses during his reign in the early 1600s. This wasn't just a mild scolding. We're talking patrols, raids, and rumors that he'd wander the streets in disguise, beheading those he caught sipping espresso after hours. Whether that's true or just over-caffeinated gossip, the fear was real enough to drive coffeehouses temporarily underground. But you can't really suppress a habit as cozy as this one for long. By the late 1600s, the bans had softened, and coffeehouses re-emerged stronger than ever. Some even argue that the crackdown backfired, pushing these spaces from social hubs into symbols of resistance. People came not just for the brew, but for the quiet thrill of freedom. A place to vent. A place to eavesdrop. A place to listen to a poem or write one on a napkin you'd later use to mop up your syrup spill. There's a particular coffeehouse that gains notoriety around this time, the Kiyilek Kavaisi. Tucked behind the Grand Bazaar, it became the unofficial clubhouse for poets, philosophers, and people who like to say things like, "Time is an illusion," before promptly spilling ink on their own shoes. At Kiyilek, you'd hear debates about Ottoman versus Persian poetic forms, or whether coffee stimulated the heart or just the bladder. Some of the empire's most enduring satire was born at those sticky tables. And of course, political gossip always swirled, though only quietly. Because even in a coffeehouse, a wall could sprout ears faster than a potted basil plant. One detail that stands out is how multi-class these places were. A cobbler might sit beside a court scribe, a janissary beside a musician, a visiting Armenian merchant beside a Bosnian storyteller, everyone leveled by the cup. Sure, there were hierarchies, but coffee had this strange flattening effect. You can't really look down on someone while you're both awkwardly chewing grounds that weren't fully filtered out. The variety of decor reflected the clientele too. In more elite neighborhoods, the coffeehouse might feature intricate inlay tables, silk cushions, and miniature fountains gurgling gently in the corner. In humbler districts, you'd get cracked stools, a lantern with a dent in it, and a cat so large and spoiled that you suspected it might be in charge. Yes, there were always cats. Cats were not only tolerated, they were beloved mascots. Fed bits of grilled meat and allowed to nap atop hookah hoses, they'd pad through the Coffeehouse like sleepy inspectors. One might curl up next to you right now, pressing a warm, purring side against your ankle, as if to say, "Don't worry, you've passed the vibe check." And what a vibey it is. You lean back again, your gaze drifting upward. The ceiling is wooden, low-beamed, and painted with faint traces of floral design. Tulips, mostly. The Ottomans adored tulips, long before Holland ever thought of them. There was even a whole tulip era, a real cultural movement of the early 18th century when extravagance bloomed, fountains multiplied, and nobles held night parties lit by floating candles on the Bosphorus. It was, essentially, a golden age of gentle partying, and coffeehouses reflected that elegance. But there's still tension underneath, because not everyone loved these places. Religious conservatives often saw them as threats, little breeding grounds for sin, slander, and that most dangerous of pastimes, thinking. Idle chatter leads to impiety, some would warn, wagging fingers at the entrance. Others, like the Sufis, saw the Coffeehouse as sacred space, a place where stories became prayer, and the warmth of the cup echoed the warmth of the divine. Both sides had a point. Neither was entirely wrong. You smile into your drink. Isn't that just like history? The lamps flicker as a draft slips through the narrow wooden lattice, and you shiver. Not from cold, but from the quiet realization that this world has pulled you in completely. The clink of porcelain, the shuffle of slippers on a worn stone floor, the rustle of pages from a dog-eared volume of poetry. All of it swells into a kind of lullaby. You're no longer a visitor. You belong here now, in this fragrant, steam-fogged corner of Ottoman memory. Let's talk about those pages, because tonight, you're going to learn that Ottoman coffeehouses weren't just about the coffee. They were literary lounges, lecture halls, unofficial universities with no tuition and very few sober professors. Poetry was the beating heart of Ottoman intellectual life, and in the coffeehouse, it didn't just sit politely on a scroll. It performed. A man with nothing but a beard, a booming voice, and a bit of flair might stand up and deliver lines so densely metaphorical that you'd need both a translator and a nap. But still, you'd applaud, or at least grunt appreciatively while slurping your drink. The most popular forms, ghazals, mostly short, rhyming couplets with a focus on longing, wine, gardens, or beloved so ethereal they made angels jealous. Poets like Biko or Fuzol were recited by memory, their names whispered like passwords. There were poetic duels too, spontaneous contests where two poets would trade verses, trying to outwit each other with clever rhymes and sneaky allusions to classical Persian epics or local gossip. Loser buys the next round of coffee, obviously. And don't think women were totally excluded. Though few women entered the Coffeehouse itself, at least not the public ones. They had their own coffee rituals at home, especially among the elite. Many Ottoman women were highly literate and deeply engaged in literary salons. Princesses and poetesses like Miri Hatton had circles of their own, sipping coffee in silk, draped interiors and critiquing verses that could make a grown man blush. Historians still argue whether these parallel literary spaces ever secretly overlapped, or whether the poetry itself was the only bridge. Then there were the metas, professional storytellers. If poetry was the soul of the coffeehouse, the meta was its voice. These men's, almost always men, would perch on a raised stool with nothing but a scarf, a cane, and a memory sharp enough to recite entire epics from scratch. 1 minute, they'd be mimicking a greedy merchant with a squawk and exaggerated eye roll. The next, they'd switch to a forlorn princess, brushing imaginary tears from their cheeks. The scarf would become a turban, then a veil, then a flag, the cane, a sword, then a spoon. Broadway had nothing on these guys. The stories they told were drawn from folklore, religion, history, and sometimes just thinly disguised satire. A bumbling sultan here, a corrupt vizier there, always cloaked in allegory, of course, to avoid any surprise appearances by the actual janissaries. But everyone knew. You always knew. There's one story in particular that becomes a coffeehouse staple: the tales of Nasreddin Haja. Haja. The man, the myth, the walking dad joke in a turban. Nasreddin's stories were short, punchy, and delightfully absurd. One day he rides his donkey backward to see where he's been. Another, he pours yogurt into a lake to turn it into soup. He's the Ottoman trickster, the lovable fool who somehow always ends up being wiser than anyone else in the story. And you can't help but laugh, even now, as someone across the room launches into a familiar Haja tale involving a fish, a court trial, and a pair of frozen boots. What's funny is that while Haja was likely based on a real 13th century figure, his stories only exploded in popularity centuries later, right when coffeehouses began multiplying across the empire. Historians still argue whether Haja was revived specifically for the coffeehouse crowd, or whether it was just the perfect pairing absurd stories and strong coffee, the peanut butter and jelly of the Ottoman world. Between the poetry, the metas, and the amateur philosophers arguing over whether fate exists, or if pigeons secretly understand math, don't ask, the Ottoman coffeehouse became a laboratory of ideas. It wasn't unusual for someone to bring a scientific manuscript and casually try to explain astronomy using only sugar cubes and a bit of string. Or for debates about Greek philosophy to erupt mid-backgammon game, sending dice flying as Plato collided with peppermint-flavored arguments. And then there was shadow theater. Yes, by the 17th century, some coffeehouses began staging Karagas and Hasavat plays. These were puppet shows projected onto a silk screen, lit by an oil lamp, and populated by the silhouettes of characters both beloved and baffling. Karagas was the loud, impulsive commoner, Hasavat his snobby, bookish foil. Together, they squabbled through satirical sketches filled with wordplay, double entendres, and more slapstick than a laundry day accident involving 15 buckets. Audience participation was encouraged. People yelled suggestions, cats meowed indifferently. And somewhere in the back, a meta would inevitably heckle the puppets with unsolicited punchlines. Imagine all of this unfolding as the hour creeps past midnight. Smoke curling lazily toward the rafters, a poet mumbling rhymes to himself in the corner, a storyteller resting his cane between acts, and a teenager carefully balancing a tray of tiny cups like they hold the world's last remaining joy. You lean forward. The taste of cardamom lingers. Someone scratches a proverb into the wall with a nail. Here, doing nothing feels like everything. Somewhere near the edge of the old bazaar, a man stumbles into a coffeehouse already humming with noise. His turban sits a little too high on his head, and the sleeves of his robe are slightly flour-dusted. He's clearly a baker or maybe a spice vendor who got distracted mid-delivery. No one blinks. In the Ottoman coffeehouse, status doesn't exactly vanish, but it does loosen. Melt, almost like sugar in the bottom of a cup. This section of your night stroll through Ottoman history is all about one thing: who actually went to these places, and why. You might imagine the Ottoman coffeehouse as the playground of the elite silken, robed scholars murmuring into mustachioed teacups. And sure, those guys were there. But so were fishermen, cooks, butchers, caravan guards who hadn't changed their socks since Edirne, a Bulgarian monk or two. Even the occasional foreign visitor, if they could mind their manners and not demand milk with their brew. That, by the way, was a fox pass akin to putting ketchup on baklava. These spaces were astonishingly democratic for the time. With very few exceptions, more on that in a moment, almost anyone could stroll in, slap down a few achy coins, and be handed the same piping hot cup as the wealthiest merchant, or the grumpiest barber. The key ingredient wasn't wealth, it was conversation. If you could keep up, or at least nod convincingly, you belong. Some folks came for the latest gossip, others to debate taxes or trade routes, still others to rehearse complaints about their mother-in-law. And then there were the ones who came purely to listen, to inhale the clatter of cups and feel a part of something, even if they never said a word. And yet, for all its openness, the coffeehouse had its quiet exclusions. Women, as mentioned earlier, were largely absent from these public spaces. While elite women had their own intellectual salons and private coffee rituals, the communal coffeehouse was, in practice, a male domain. Historians still argue whether this gender division was purely cultural, or whether it had more to do with emerging anxieties about public mixing in urban spaces. Even among men, not everyone was welcome with open arms. Ottoman officials and certain religious scholars looked down on coffeehouses as potential breeding grounds for sedition, or at the very least, for bad poetry and worse fashion. You see, the coffeehouse wasn't just a place for storytelling. It was a political incubator. Let's say you were a local janissary who thought your wages were too low, or a merchant frustrated by a new tax on cloves, or simply a guy who heard a rumor that the Grand Vizier's cousin had been caught stealing carpets. Where would you air that frustration? Not the mosque, and definitely not your mother-in-law's house. You'd take it to the coffeehouse. There, your mild complaint could snowball into a heated discussion, and then into a "the whole system is broken" kind of speech. Next thing you know, someone sketching a protest slogan into spilled sugar. There were even moments in Ottoman history where coffeehouses were accused of harboring sedition, a crime just vague enough to be applied whenever a ruler got nervous about his public approval ratings. That's why, periodically, the state tried to shut them down. Yes, the coffeehouse has a criminal record. Several sultans, starting with Murad IV in the 17th century, issued outright bans. Murad, famous for both his personal strength and his public temper tantrums, not only outlawed coffee but made drinking it a capital offense. Guards were known to roam the streets, sniffing for roast beans like caffeine bloodhounds. Caught sipping, off with your head. Or at the very least, off to jail with you and your poor barista. Historians still argue whether Murad was genuinely offended by coffee or just saw the coffeehouse as a threat to his grip on power. After all, people talking together over hot drinks are rarely easy to control, and yet, the bans never stuck. Like a determined house cat, the coffeehouse kept slipping back in through the window. People built underground establishments, passed coded invitations, brewed their coffee behind false walls. There were even rumors of coffeehouses disguised as barber shops. So if a man took too long to get his beard trimmed, it might be because he was hiding behind the curtain, listening to poetry while sipping a hot, banned beverage. It got to the point where officials would sometimes just look the other way. Enforcement was exhausting, and besides, most of the janissaries were hooked on the stuff too. Still, those early raids gave the coffeehouse a bit of a rebellious edge. Even once bans were lifted, a whiff of danger clung to the culture. It was the Ottoman version of sneaking out to a late night jazz club, except instead of saxophones you had shadow puppets and a guy loudly comparing viziers to donkeys. Despite these ups and downs, or maybe because of them, the coffeehouse flourished. It became one of the few truly public spheres in a deeply hierarchical society. You didn't need a title, or a book, or even a good sense of humor, though that helped. You just needed to show up. And here's the thing that might surprise you, for all their freedom of speech, Ottoman coffeehouses rarely devolved into chaos. There was an unspoken etiquette. Don't interrupt a storyteller mid-tale. Don't hog the water pipe. Don't argue too loudly unless you brought snacks. And always, always, tip the boy who brought your cup. These small rituals bound everyone together. Whether you were a porter unloading bricks or a judge fresh from the divine, once inside, you were just another person trying not to spill scalding liquid on your robes while pretending to understand a convoluted joke about Persian grammar. It's comforting, isn't it? Knowing that centuries ago, people sat side by side, arguing nonsense and drinking something warm. Not for money, not for power, just to feel a little less alone. You step back into the hazy room, the smell of cardamom and roasted beans wrapping around you like an old woolen shawl. This section is all about the rituals, how the Ottoman coffeehouse experience unfolded from first sip to last smoke, and why those tiny details mattered. First, the preparation. Ottoman coffee wasn't just dumped into a cup and chugged down like today's instant brew. Oh no, the process was a quiet ceremony. The beans, carefully roasted over a low flame until their surface glistened like polished obsidian, were ground finely with a mortar and pestle. Some say the Ottoman grind was so fine it could slip through the cracks in the sieve and still carry flavor. Then came the sezva, small, long-handled copper pot designed specifically for brewing this magical elixir. You watch the coffee as it bubbles slowly, the foam rising like clouds over a dark sea. That foam, called kamak, was prized more than the liquid itself. The first sip was to savor the kaimak, the creamy cap that formed on top. Baristas in the coffee houses often prided themselves on how well they could create this foam, almost like latte art's antique ancestor. One particularly quirky tidbit: Ottoman coffee was traditionally unfiltered, so those grounds you taste at the bottom of your cup weren't considered a nuisance. They were part of the ritual. In fact, some coffeehouse patrons would read their fortunes in these grounds after finishing, tracing shapes and symbols to divine their futures. Imagine your barista moonlighting as a mystic. Pretty cozy, right? Historians still argue whether coffee's ritual importance was more cultural or spiritual. Was the kaimak simply a sensory delight, or did it symbolize a kind of social elevation? A mark of belonging to a learned class? Probably a bit of both. Next, the seating arrangements. Ottoman coffeehouses were rarely spacious palaces. Instead, they were cozy, with low benches, cushioned mats, and often an alcove or two for privacy. Patrons sat in small circles, sometimes on raised platforms called divans, which doubled as couches for long conversations. If you got there early, you'd pick your spot carefully. close enough to hear the storyteller, but far enough to avoid the smoking hookah cloud. And speaking of hookahs, yes, water pipes were often part of the experience. The slow, fragrant smoke mixed with the bitter coffee aroma created an atmosphere both intimate and surreal. You'd find people quietly puffing, eyes half closed, lost in thought, or just enjoying the soft rhythm of others chatting nearby. There was also a very specific soundscape in these coffee houses. The clicking of backgammon pieces, the murmur of hushed debates, the occasional burst of laughter, and the soft clink of porcelain cups on saucers. Sometimes, a traveling minstrel or kes kind of bard would play a gentle tune on the saz, a stringed instrument, adding to the atmosphere without stealing attention. Here's a fun detail: unlike many other cultures, Ottoman coffee houses often had men of all social ranks rubbing shoulders. Imagine a court poet chatting quietly with a fisherman or a tailor. The physical closeness helped break down social barriers, at least temporarily, which was quite radical for the time. And if the day turned to night, the lighting inside the coffee house played a subtle role too. Oil lamps and candles flickered, casting long shadows on the textured walls, while outside the streets darkened and quieted. This gentle dimness made the coffee house feel like a hidden haven, a place removed from the rush of the city. You might imagine patrons leaning in closer to hear whispered tales of distant lands or political intrigue. The low lighting encouraged confidences, a soft veil over the sometimes sharp edges of conversation. But don't think everything was peaceful and polite all the time. Ottoman coffee houses could get lively, even boisterous. Debates sometimes escalated to full-on verbal jousts, especially during times of political tension. The sharp wit of a clever storyteller or the biting sarcasm of a frustrated merchant could fill the room, keeping everyone on their toes. Historians still argue whether these debates served as genuine forums for public opinion or were more theatrical performances aimed at social bonding rather than political change. Finally, the closing rituals. The coffee house didn't just empty suddenly at closing time. Instead, the energy faded slowly. Cups were drained with a lingering slurp, cushions fluffed, and the hookah hose passed one last time. The barista swept the floor with practiced ease, preparing for the next day's bustle. And as you leave, you can almost hear the faint echoes of laughter and the soft patter of slippers on stone floors. Carrying on the night's stories well into the morning, you find yourself stepping back into the coffee house's rhythm, now focusing on the people who animated these spaces. The patrons, the storytellers, and the unseen hands that kept the wheels turning. This section uncovers the social tapestry woven within Ottoman coffee houses and why they were more than just places to sip. Most patrons were men, yes, but their backgrounds could hardly have been more diverse. You'd see scholars draped in their scholarly robes, merchants still dusted from their latest trade caravan, bureaucrats clutching documents, and artisans whose hands carried the stories of their crafts. Coffee houses were, in a way, the original social networks, hubs where news traveled faster than in official channels. One quirky detail you might not expect: some coffee houses had designated storytellers, who specialized in reciting epic poems or tales from folklore. These weren't just entertainers, they were cultural custodians, tasked with preserving oral histories and spreading news. It's like having a live podcast host, but in flowing robes and a turban. And speaking of news, coffee houses functioned as informal newsrooms, where gossip mingled with politics and poetry. You could overhear heated debates about the Sultan's latest decree or whispered rumors about distant battles. This made the coffee houses a hotbed of public opinion, much like modern social media, but with better coffee and fewer cat memes. But here's a gentle irony: while these spaces fostered intellectual debate, some authorities viewed them warily. There were periodic crackdowns because coffee houses were sometimes seen as breeding grounds for dissent. Yet, rather than vanishing, coffee houses adapted, weaving themselves more deeply into Ottoman urban life. Historians still argue whether these crackdowns were attempts to stifle free speech or simple efforts to maintain public order. Either way, the coffee house remained a resilient cultural fixture. Another detail worth savoring: the coffee house staff. Baristas, known as cavasis, were more than servers, they were social facilitators. They knew the regulars, remembered preferred brews, and often acted as mediators during disputes. Imagine a barista today remembering your name and exactly how you like your latte, but with centuries of tradition behind it. Women, though largely excluded from these male-dominated spaces, had their own parallel coffee gatherings, often in private homes. These were more intimate affairs, with different rituals and social rules. So, while the public coffeehouses buzzed with male voices, the culture of coffee permeated wider society in quieter ways. And as you sit, sipping a cup of this thick, bittersweet coffee, you might notice the light flickering off the brass trays, the steam curling like ancient smoke signals. The Ottoman coffeehouse was not just a place to drink. It was a stage for human connection, where stories, ideas, and warmth were brewed alongside the coffee. You settle back into the gentle hum of the coffeehouse, ready to explore the culinary side of Ottoman coffee culture and the sweet treats that accompanied your cup. This section delves into the flavors that softened the coffee's robust bitterness and how food rituals made coffeehouse visits feel like mini celebrations. The first thing you notice is the traditional companion to Ottoman coffee, the lokum, better known to many as Turkish delight. These soft, sugar-dusted cubes, sometimes studded with pistachios or rose petals, were crafted to perfectly balance the strong, earthy bitterness of the coffee. Biting into a piece, the sweetness spreads slowly like a quiet little party in your mouth. These delights were often served on ornate silver trays, inviting you to savor each bite as much as the coffee itself. But the sweet side didn't stop there. Nuts, dried fruits, and honeyed pastries also made frequent appearances. Some coffeehouses even had specialized bakers who prepared fresh treats daily, ensuring that every visit felt a little more indulgent. Imagine the aroma of freshly baked baklava wafting through the air, mingling with the coffee's rich scent. Pure cozy magic. Oddly enough, some recipes from Ottoman times included spices you might not expect today: cloves, cinnamon, even a touch of saffron in the desserts, which added layers of warmth and complexity. It's like a gentle explosion of flavors that complemented the slow sip of coffee. Historians still argue whether these treats were simply culinary pleasures, or if they played a deeper social role, encouraging longer visits and more lingering conversations. Either way, they were key to the coffeehouse atmosphere. Part snack, part social glue. You might chuckle to learn that early European travelers often misunderstood the sweetened coffee rituals, sometimes assuming the Ottoman coffee was far sweeter than it really was, thanks to the lokum served alongside. It's a reminder that culture's little quirks can be lost in translation. As you nibble on your imaginary treat, picture the ornate cups, small, handle-less porcelain vessels resting on delicate saucers, sometimes hand-painted with intricate floral designs. The size kept each serving fresh and warm, encouraging slow, mindful drinking. You'd rarely see a two-go cup here. Coffee was meant to be an experience, not a convenience. And speaking of experience, the etiquette of sharing these sweets also mattered. Offering a piece of lokum to a friend was a small but meaningful gesture of hospitality, symbolizing trust and goodwill. The ritual reinforced bonds between strangers and friends alike. The ritual extended beyond taste to the very presentation and serving of these delicacies, emphasizing beauty and ceremony. The barista's careful arrangement of cups and sweets was part performance, part care, a subtle invitation to savor life's small comforts. As you sit back and imagine the rich tastes and scents mingling in the warm air, it's clear the Ottoman coffeehouse wasn't just about caffeine. It was a sensory sanctuary where food and drink nurtured body and spirit alike. You ease deeper into the Ottoman coffeehouse world, now turning your attention to the music and entertainment that floated softly through these cozy spaces. This section reveals how sound shaped the atmosphere and made coffeehouses a gentle refuge from the day's demands. Music was an integral part of the coffeehouse experience, but not the blaring or frenetic kind. Instead, you hear the delicate pluck of the oud, a pear-shaped lute with a voice like a whispering wind, or the soft drone of the knee, a reed flute whose breathy notes seem to curl and dissolve like steam rising from your coffee cup. These instruments wove together melodies that invited calm reflection rather than raucous celebration. Performers, often skilled musicians or poets, took turns sharing their art, sometimes improvising verses that danced around current events or philosophical musings. Imagine sitting there, the gentle cadence of poetry blending with the music, lulling your thoughts into a soft haze. Coffeehouses were less concert halls and more intimate salons where art felt close enough to touch. One quirky detail is that some coffeehouses develop signature songs or chants, almost like musical logos, signaling the start or end of a session. These melodic cues helped mark the passage of time in a setting where clocks were few and far between. It's a bit like having a soundtrack for your coffee break, crafted centuries before Spotify playlists. Historians still argue whether the presence of music encouraged more lively debates or simply provided a peaceful backdrop that softened discussions. Perhaps both are true. depending on the mood of the crowd and the skill of the performers. You might smile knowing that coffeehouse musicians weren't always professionals. Some were regular patrons who discovered a hidden talent or a passion for poetry, sharing their creations with an encouraging audience. This blurred the line between performer and listener, making the experience communal and participatory. Occasionally, humorous skits or storytelling sessions would also take place, adding a playful layer to the ambience. Laughter, low and warm like a fireplace, mingled with the music, reminding everyone that these gatherings were as much about joy as contemplation. And while music and poetry created a gentle cocoon, coffee houses still welcomed spirited discussion on everything from politics to philosophy. The soundscape balanced stimulation with relaxation, helping you linger longer and perhaps dream a little. So, as you imagine the notes drifting softly around you, blending with the aroma of coffee and the clink of delicate cups, the Ottoman coffeehouse reveals itself as a true multisensory haven, a place where all senses find a gentle, welcoming rhythm. You drift deeper into the cozy Ottoman coffeehouse, ready now to explore the architectural and design elements that shape these inviting spaces. This section reveals how the physical surroundings contributed to that comforting atmosphere and what subtle details made coffeehouses feel like second homes. Most coffeehouses were modest in size, often tucked into bustling city streets, but designed with a focus on warmth and intimacy. You'd notice low wooden tables surrounded by cushioned seating, piles of plush pillows and soft carpets, encouraging patrons to settle in comfortably for hours. The design invited slow, unhurried visits, a stark contrast to today's quick, on-the-go coffee stops. Light filtered softly through latticed windows or colorful stained glass, casting gentle patterns on walls adorned with calligraphy or delicate tilework. The decor spoke of quiet beauty, avoiding ostentation while reflecting the refined tastes of Ottoman society. Sometimes small brass lamps flickered with candlelight or oil, adding a golden glow that made the space feel both timeless and soothing. One charming detail was the presence of built-in shelves, stocked with books or scrolls on everything from poetry to history. These coffeehouses often doubled as informal libraries, encouraging quiet reading or study alongside socializing. It's like finding a cozy cafe with a personal reading nook, only with centuries of culture layered into every corner. Historians still argue whether the architecture evolved more from practical needs, such as urban space constraints, or from deliberate design choices aimed at fostering a particular social mood. Either way, the effect was unmistakably calming. Interestingly, some coffeehouses featured small gardens or courtyards where patrons could escape to fresh air without leaving the premises. These outdoor spaces added a natural element, with fragrant plants and trickling water creating a sensory balance to the dark, wood-heavy interiors. You might also be amused to learn that there were subtle, quiet zones, and lively zones within some larger coffeehouses, a practical early form of managing noise levels. The soft-spoken debates happened near the bookcases, while louder card games or storytelling filled other corners. This spatial etiquette allowed for varied experiences under one roof, and as you run your hand over the smooth wooden table or feel the softness of the cushions, it becomes clear that Ottoman coffeehouses were crafted to be gentle sanctuaries. Every element, from lighting to layout, worked in harmony to invite relaxation and lingering conversation. So, as you sit back and imagine the play of light and shadow, the quiet rustle of pages, and the murmur of friendly voices, the coffeehouse reveals itself as a carefully curated world of comfort, connection, and calm. You settle in more comfortably as we explore the daily rhythms and routines that shaped visits to Ottoman coffeehouses, revealing how time itself seemed to slow down within these cozy walls. This section invites you to picture the ebb and flow of patrons, the subtle social choreography, and the gentle rituals that punctuated each day. Mornings often began quietly with a few early risers, merchants, artisans, or scholars, seeking their first cup of the day. The coffeehouse, still fresh and cool, welcomed them like a soft blanket after the chill of dawn. They sipped their coffee slowly, reading or exchanging muted greetings, easing into the day's demands. By mid-morning, the pace gently increased. Groups gathered, sometimes split by profession or interest, their conversations weaving around current events, poetry, or the latest gossip. You can almost hear the soft laughter mingling with the clink of coffee cups, a background soundtrack of comfort and camaraderie. Afternoons brought a different crowd, perhaps students or bureaucrats taking a break, old friends reconnecting, or even solitary thinkers lost in thought. The coffeehouse became a refuge from the sun's heat or the city's bustle. many patrons moved fluidly between reading, chatting, or simply resting, allowing the slow drip of time to ease their minds. Evening visits often extended into the night, especially during cooler months. The coffeehouse transformed into a more lively hub, where music and storytelling filled the air. Candles flickered, shadows danced, and the room buzzed with soft energy. It was a place to unwind, reflect, or simply enjoy company without the day's pressures. A quirky detail is that some coffeehouses operated with a kind of tab system, allowing patrons to order coffee or snacks throughout their stay without immediate payment, trusting that accounts would be settled later. This trust reflected the social fabric woven into these spaces, where personal honor and relationships mattered deeply. Historians still argue whether this flexible, unhurried schedule was a luxury afforded mainly to city elites or a more widespread social practice. Either way, it shaped the coffeehouse's reputation as a timeless haven from the rush outside. You might find it amusing that some patrons used coffeehouses as informal offices, conducting business deals or writing correspondence amid the cozy clatter. Imagine drafting letters by lamplight while the scent of coffee and sweets lingers nearby. A blend of work and pleasure that feels surprisingly modern. So as you picture the gentle rhythms of daily life unfolding within those softly lit rooms, the Ottoman coffeehouse emerges as a place where time seemed to pause, offering moments of rest, connection, and quiet joy. As you settle more deeply into the Ottoman coffeehouse atmosphere, it's time to savor the culinary side. The sweet and savory treats that accompanied each cup, turning a simple coffee break into a full sensory delight. This section paints a picture of the tastes, textures, and aromas that softened the day and enhanced the cozy ambience. Ottoman coffeehouses rarely serve just coffee. Alongside the dark, rich brew, you'd find small plates of delicacies designed to complement and contrast the bitter notes. Imagine a dainty baklava, its layers of flaky pastry dripping with honey and nuts, melting slowly on your tongue, or a fragrant lokum, what we call Turkish delight, offering a chewy, subtly floral sweetness dusted with powdered sugar. Savory options included spiced nuts, dried fruits, or tiny meat-filled pastries known as burek, whose crisp, golden crusts crumbled pleasantly with each bite. These treats were usually served in modest portions, perfect for nibbling without disrupting the meditative rhythm of sipping and chatting. Interestingly, some coffeehouses boasted specialty drinks besides plain coffee. Variations infused with rosewater, cinnamon, or cardamom offered subtle shifts in flavor that patrons eagerly explored. These gentle twists transformed the coffee ritual into an aromatic journey, each cup a small adventure. Historians still argue whether these snacks were staples for all visitors or luxuries reserved for wealthier clientele. Some evidence suggests that common folk might have simply enjoyed their coffee black and strong, while others indulged in these added comforts. You might smile at the fact that sweets were often served on tiny silver trays, accompanied by delicate porcelain cups, making every serving feel like a miniature celebration. This attention to detail helped elevate the humble coffee break into a moment of ritualized pleasure. The presence of these treats also encouraged longer stays. Patrons nibbled between sips, slowing their pace further and enhancing the sense of ease and indulgence. Coffee houses, then, were not just places for caffeine, but hubs of gentle sensory delight, where taste and smell mingled with sound and sight. So as you imagine the faint sweetness lingering on your lips, mingling with the rich coffee aroma and the warm glow of the room, you begin to understand how the Ottoman coffeehouse offered a feast for all senses. A truly cozy retreat from the world outside. You're nearly at the end of this gentle journey through Ottoman coffeehouse culture, but there's one more fascinating layer to explore: the social roles and surprising inclusivity that these spaces sometimes fostered. Here, you'll find that coffeehouses were more than just places to sip and snack. They were quietly progressive in their own way. For one, coffeehouses often welcomed a broad spectrum of patrons. While many visitors were men, there's historical evidence suggesting that women, particularly in certain regions or under specific circumstances, had their own designated coffeehouses or times when they could attend. This quietly challenged the strictly gendered public spaces typical of the era. The coffeehouse also served as a rare social equalizer, where people of different social classes mingled more freely than elsewhere. Artisans, scholars, merchants, and even government officials might share a table or engage in the same debates. This informal mixing created a vibrant intellectual atmosphere that some historians liken to early public forums. A quirky tidbit: some coffeehouses doubled as meeting spots for secret clubs or societies, where members discussed politics or literature under the guise of casual conversation. These hush gatherings contributed to the coffeehouse's reputation as a cradle for both culture and subtle resistance. Historians still argue whether this inclusivity was widespread or limited to elite urban centers like Istanbul. Some suggest that the coffeehouse's role varied greatly by location, reflecting local customs and social hierarchies. It's amusing to think that, despite their relaxed and cozy vibe, coffeehouses could also be places of whispered intrigue and spirited debate, quietly shaping the course of Ottoman social life. They were hubs of community, connection, and sometimes quiet rebellion. So, as you imagine the murmur of diverse voices blending with the clatter of coffee cups and the warm glow of lamps, the Ottoman coffeehouse reveals itself as a surprisingly dynamic space, one where comfort and culture brewed side by side. You've arrived at the final chapter of this soothing exploration, where the legacy of Ottoman coffeehouses gently unfurls across time and culture. This section reflects on how their cozy spirit influenced not only Ottoman society, but also modern coffee culture worldwide, wrapping up your journey with a sense of timeless connection. Long after the Ottoman Empire faded, the coffeehouse tradition it nurtured traveled far and wide. From Vienna's elegant cafes to Parisian salons, echoes of that warm, inviting atmosphere carried on. You can almost taste the lineage in every carefully brewed cup, and every quiet corner designed for lingering conversations. What makes this legacy so enduring is not just the coffee itself, but the atmosphere of comfort, community, and contemplation, the very essence of those Ottoman spaces. Today's coffee shops, with their cozy chairs, soft lighting, and invitation to slow down, owe a nod to that centuries-old blueprint. A quirky detail to imagine: some modern baristas playfully recreate Ottoman coffee rituals, using traditional sezivs and serving coffee grounds with a wink and a story. It's a small but meaningful reminder of history's gentle footprints in everyday life. Historians still argue how much of today's global coffee culture is a direct inheritance versus independent reinvention. Yet, there's little doubt that the Ottoman coffeehouse set a standard for what a coffee space could be, a place not just for drinking, but for breathing, thinking, and belonging. So as you sink deeper into your own cozy nook tonight, consider the centuries of comfort, conversation, and calm that ripple through each sip you take. The Ottoman coffeehouse lives on in these moments, inviting you to pause, relax, and drift gently into dreams.